Hey everybody, welcome back to Left to Reckoning. My name is David Griscom, and I'm really happy to be joined here today by Grace Blakeley, who's a Marxist economist, staff writer at Tribune Magazine, host of A World to Win podcast, author of The Corona Crash, How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism, and also the author of this book, which you'll be happy to hear, Stolen, which I've had to buy 3 times because I keep on misplacing it when I'm reading it on the train or traveling or whatever. But thank you so much for joining us today, Grace.
Thanks so much for having me. I hope that an unsuspecting, middle of the road politically person picked up those books that you left and has had a radical turnaround in their entire view of the world as a result.
Yeah, I was hoping the same thing too. They were in good location, so hopefully for that. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I really want to be covering today, so I think we should jump into it. Particularly, we have to talk about this thing, which pretty much every show or article or anything we're dealing with right now has to deal with, which is this coronavirus crisis. But one striking aspect of the coronavirus, the COVID economy, now that we're, approaching almost a year into the lockdowns, has been just how clearly class-based the effects of it has been. Apart from the initial shock, things have really stabilized financially for those at the top. In fact, been extremely beneficial for many of the wealthiest people in the United States and the United Kingdom. Not just when it comes to dealing from the virus, but its real effects on the U.S. economy and the economy for working people. What do you think that this kind of coronavirus shock revealed about the state of the United States and the United Kingdom's economy? And also, if you want to comment as well on the global economy.
Yeah, so a lot.
Yeah, of course.
I'll try and kind of address each of these things in turn. So you picked up on one point there, which was that there was already quite high levels of inequality in both of those societies. It's more extreme in the US, but there is also a lot of inequality in the UK, and we'd been underestimating it for quite some time as well. And that comes up in terms of both income inequality and wealth inequality. And those two things then feed into other forms of inequality, like intergenerational inequality, regional inequality, etc., which are obviously big things in both of those economies as well. Now, what the pandemic has done is it really has deepened those divides, both between the kind of top 1% and the 99%, but also between the kind of upper middle class, people with some savings, with some assets, and everyone else. And this is, I think, something that's really important that we need to wrap our heads around, because what you've seen in both the US and the UK is a huge increase in the savings ratio. So basically the amount of money that households are putting aside into savings. Now, this is obviously because they can't go out and spend their money in the same way as they could in the past. This is mainly people working from home who are perhaps, furloughed in the UK or some sort of similar scheme in the US, and they can't go out and spend their money. They're on the same amount of pay, or just a little bit less pay, but their expenses are less. And then that's contrasted with another group of people who are either have lost their jobs and so are unemployed, or have seen a big decrease in their earnings, or who've seen an increase in their outgoings, or who've just kind of basically, seen things be broadly flat, but who were in a bad situation before, who were in the red before. And we know that in both the US and the UK, there was this big phenomenon of household debt, which didn't go away after the financial crisis, which stuck around, especially since, wages didn't increase very much in the period between the last crisis and this one. So you've already got that divide that exists, and it's being deepened by the kind of very dynamics of what's going on with work during the pandemic. The other big factor to take into consideration here is this question of wealth. So those better off people are more likely to have some investments, whether that's through their pensions, whether it's like a house or a second house or whatever. And those assets have increased in value a lot. I mean, obviously, the stock market's very volatile at the moment, but broadly speaking, we've seen quite a significant amount of asset price inflation, especially in the US. And that's primarily been driven by central bank policy. So by very, very low interest rates and by these huge asset purchasing programs that the Fed and the Bank of England have undertaken. And basically that has meant that, that gap has become even bigger between those people who have assets and who are seeing capital gains as a result, and those people who have no assets and maybe who have large debts, but often who don't actually benefit from lower interest rates because they are seen as a kind of credit risk. So they're actually paying relatively high interest rates as well. And that is going to be a real problem when we come out of the pandemic, because there are going to be a lot of kind of supply chain issues when we come out of the pandemic anyway. So it's going to be difficult to kind of get source certain items. There's going to be issues with supply chains and all that sort of stuff, which means there's potentially already some inflationary pressure. But if you've got this group over here with a lot of money going out and spending loads and loads and loads of money, on all the things that they couldn't buy for the last several years, that potentially creates some inflation, which harms these people who don't have those savings, and who spend a higher portion of their incomes on just like the things they basically need to survive. So that's one big problem that we're going to be seeing, and that was fed into by those issues that existed before the pandemic, primarily around inequality. But there are also a whole host of other issues to do with the kind of structure of the economy. So, we came into the pandemic, as I said, with high inequality, with what had broadly been a very long-term stagnation of wages, relatively high levels of household debt, but also very, very high levels of corporate debt. And particularly in the US, amongst risky firms, basically, there was a big boom in kind of what's called high yield corporate debt. So debt that for corporations that are a bit of a credit risk, basically. And as we came into the pandemic with that big debt overhang. Obviously, everything ground to a halt. A lot of businesses found that they couldn't pay their debts, or they were struggling to pay their debts. A lot went under. Some have had access to state support, which has allowed them to just about tick over. But when that state support is withdrawn, they might go under as well. So we're getting these pressures towards consolidation and rising market concentration in a lot of sectors. And that feeds off, again, a longer term trend of the growth of monopoly power in a lot of different sectors in the global north. I mean, this is most obvious in the tech sector, but it is equally apparent in a lot of other sectors that you maybe don't notice it in, because you've got these kind of, you've got lots of different brands, but they're actually all owned by one or, two or three or four or five big companies. So it kind of, in pharmaceuticals, in food and agriculture and all these different sorts of things, there's quite a lot of consolidation at the level of the global economy, even in those industries. So that's going to be accelerated. And then, of course, this longer term trend that we've seen really since the financial crisis, and this is something that you mentioned earlier, we'll probably talk a bit more about, is of kind of higher levels of government intervention in the economy, but that not necessarily being progressive. And we've particularly seen this with, what in the US is referred to as kind of corporate welfare, in which, it is a massive, massive phenomenon in the US to a whole host of different industries, just basically the American state kind of spewing cash at various different vested interests. But it's also an issue here. It's become a much bigger issue, I think, during the pandemic. And yeah, that is something I think the left needs to get its head around, because we're still kind of a bit in this place of, we just want the state to spend more and do more stuff. We're not really interrogating the nature of the state and the kind of implications of its behavior.
Yeah, and I think especially in the U.S. case, when it comes to like Federal Reserve policy, what we've seen, Mark Blythe, I think, used a good analogy. It's like we saw that the pipes only flow one way, and you saw that through a lot of programs. When like the Paycheck Protection Program, for example, organizations, companies that already had deep financial relationships with the banks were first in line. And while some of the smaller businesses, people who might, be using like a local bank or something like that, had a much harder time getting that federal program. And I think there's one thing to know that people should be paying attention to right now, especially the left, and understanding that there is this looking like a significant shift when it comes to the power of like monopoly capital. I know there was a piece in the Financial Times recently, I can't remember his name, but one of the C-suite members of like Starbucks was basically like humbly bragging about how Starbucks is going to be doing very well in the post-coronavirus economy, because he's going to be able to buy up all of the coffee shops across the country. And I would like to hear your thoughts about how I want to talk a bit later about the difference between like increased government action as socialism. But I wanted to ask you right now, what do you think this kind of very apparent delineation that we've seen with the state basically picking certain actors and certain players to receive the aid, while being completely incapable, especially in the United States case, of providing aid to everyday people?
I think there's a concept from within Marxist kind of political economy that it's really important to understand when we're thinking about this process, which is this idea of centralization.
Mm.
And the centralization of capitalism encompasses the kind of growth of monopoly power with the kind of general movement towards, I suppose, more concentrated power across the whole economy. So that tends to look like, yes, an increase in monopoly power, but alongside that, rising concentration in the finance sector,
Mm.
a kind of growth, a relative growth of the power and wealth of some states over others, and imperial power is a very important part of that, and crucially the links between these different things. So we have monopoly capital in the global north, a number of very, very big, very, very powerful corporations that are basically able to kind of extract value from the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And those have very, very close links with financial institutions and also with the state. And, obviously, all these links go each way. So the state is very, very interlinked with finance, obviously, without the power of seigniorage, without all the sorts of regulations that the state creates to the finance sector wouldn't exist. And that goes both ways, because obviously, the finance sector is a really, really big and powerful lobbyer, and also kind of generates a lot of, creates the kind of structural conditions in which capital accumulation takes place. So it's got a lot of structural power. The links between states and big businesses are obviously very, very, deep. And again, big business has this structural power of capital flight or strike and overemployment and all these other sorts of things. And that obviously increases as you get concentration. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
both just for the very obvious reason that there's a smaller number of people that you can get into a room and say, right, this is what we want to do with the economy. Everyone get on board, almost like what happened in the wake of the financial crisis, when you literally did have a bunch of very powerful people in a room with discussions over who's going to do what, who's going to get what. So, there's a reason for this. It's not a kind of conspiratorial understanding of capitalism where it's controlled by a couple of, big, powerful entities. It's more like, this is a process where we're starting to see a concentration and consolidation of power within the economy. That power is never absolute. So none of these guys are able to completely control what happens in the markets. We still get crises. We still have a level of kind of complexity, but their power to be able to influence those events and to be able to benefit from them is growing. And that is kind of what we mean when we talk about the centralization of capitalism. And I think it's really important to understand, because, it allows us to see capital, so firms and financial institutions, alongside the state and crucially empires as well, as all part of this system, as part of this totality. And rather than thinking, business is bad, state good, which can often be the kind of default position of a lot of people on the left, you can see the ways in which all of these institutions are linked together within this, system of capital, the capitalist world system that, exists at the level of the global economy. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's important. And just, empirically, we are obviously seeing that process accelerate, particularly when it comes to big business and corporations. The financial crisis was actually a period of centralization within the finance sector. A lot of banks went under and they were bought by other banks, particularly for American banks. That was there was a lot of concentration there. Today, we're seeing a lot of businesses go under. And as you just said, Marx has this passage that, capital grows in a few hands where it is lost by many, which happens during crises. During crises, smaller, weaker businesses go under and their assets are bought up by bigger ones. We're seeing that, as you say, Starbucks is a good example in the UK, Arcadia, which was a big retail group, collapsing and being bought up by another set of firms. We're going to see a lot more activity like that. I was actually reading today about how Chevron and ExxonMobil were in merger talks last year, which would have been mega. It was like the reunification of Standard Oil, basically. That didn't end up happening, but it's potentially
the gears are turning in that direction.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, this is all kind of explicable within that logic of centralization.
Yeah, and the centralization for sure, and I mean, just take a second. Imagine when we were back like in March, and when this all was first happening. Look, I'm a socialist, and sometimes people misunderstand me when I say this, but I have been in awe at just how bad, in particular, the American state has been with dealing with this crisis. Like, I never expected the Trump administration, or let alone the Democratic Party, to be really standing up for working people and to do a kind of reshuffling. There's all this bold talk, honestly, when COVID first started, that there might be this massive, reshuffling of capitalism because people are going to become more reliant on the state. And what we actually saw was just a mass scale abandonment of working people. The fact that, like the fact that we're right now have, a Biden administration, which essentially at least has the power through, the Senate and the House to be able to go forward with those $2,000 payments that they promised everybody back in January. And they're still, dragging their feet over this. I know this is an impossible question to answer, but I would love your sort of feelings. Like, has the state just I guess the political class in general, this is more of a political economy question, I guess, but like, have they just lost the ability to be able to do basic kind of stimulus programs for working people? Or do you think, like, is it a question of like incapacity on their ability, or is it a question of like they actually know that they're benefiting and the system is very much benefiting from the immiseration of everyday people? Because I can't figure it out.
So I think there's a couple of things going on here. I mean, first, like how we conceptualize the state is important. So I think the way I like to think about it draws a lot on Nikos Poudantzas's formulation of state power, which is to view the state as a site of class struggle. And that struggle that takes place within the state, within various different elements of the state apparatus, is an unequal struggle because it reflects broader social relations. So it reflects the balance of power outside of the state as well. During the post-war period, you have a corporatist state that is interested in basically negotiating between capital and labor to create this kind of social compromise. But it's with the defeat of the organized working class that you begin to see a state that is really heavily reorienting itself towards supporting the interests of capital. And the foundations of that shift electorally come with the construction of this kind of mini capitalist class of like, the middle classes who also come to own assets. And that ends up being a really important shift in the political economy of the global north. It's based on a deepening of imperialism at the level of the global economy. So I think this is a really important point to get. It's not that everyone's becoming middle class. It's that middle class will have become concentrated in parts of the global north, and the actual labor of production is taking place elsewhere. But that political bargain was really important, really solid. Lots of people got access to housing. Lots of people got private pensions. So they thought, our interests broadly aligned with those of other asset owners. And that's what we're seeing today is a continuation of that, because really, all a kind of a standard capitalist state in the global north needs to do to, well, a political party within the state needs to do to kind of consolidate its position and retain its legitimacy, is to maintain that bargain between the kind of property owning classes and the 1%. And the way that it's doing that at the moment is through quantitative easing. So even if there is an insufficient amount of state spending to promote, let's say, high productivity, or just to meet the basic needs of people at the bottom of the income spectrum, it doesn't really matter, because a big chunk of the people who are going to be voting are asset owning older people who maybe don't even work anyway, and so are much more reliant upon their assets than they are of the state of the whole economy. Another factor in this is that working class voters have just been dropping out of the electorate really ever since the 1990s, because the party that was supposed to represent them has reoriented itself towards supporting this middle class as well. So there is like an obvious explanation for this, which is that the state is not taking into account the interests of working people who don't own capital, because it doesn't have to, and because those people don't really have a voice. Like, they aren't represented really anymore by the unions, by kind of many other organizations that can operate on their behalf within the state, whereas capital has a huge amount of lobbying power. And actually, the property owning middle classes as well have lobbying groups that will kind of go act on their behalf in various different parts of the state. And obviously, their position and their happiness, their satisfaction with the way things are going is like a really big factor in determining the legitimacy of the state. So the big challenge for the left is actually being able to kind of separate out this chunk of asset owning kind of middle earners into those who are, just in like very well-paying professional managerial jobs, and who will always align themselves with the elite, and those who actually, could be convinced that their living standards are declining, their pay is declining, there are all these other crises that are taking place around them. We need a fundamental change, and that can only be delivered by the organized power of working people, whilst also encouraging those people who've dropped out of the electorate to rejoin it, to create this coalition of kind of, labor against capital, which also necessarily has to be broader than just labor. It has to encompass all the different forms of social movement organizing that have become so much more prominent in recent years. So yeah, I mean, that is, I think, the question. It's like, what is the state of class struggle in society as a whole, and how is that being reflected by what's happening within the state?
Yeah, and it's really difficult. And Ronan Burtenshaw at Tribune has a line that I quote all the time, that
He'll be
he's
happy to hear that.
I probably quoted too much, but it's good. It's like the job of the left right now is to convince working class people that politics can change their lives, right? And particularly the United States and where I'm from in the South, growing up as a poor person in the South, there was no hope that being politically engaged was going to benefit your life. If anything, it was defensive, right? It's like, how can I stop things from getting worse? Which is, not something that is really going to have the sustained motivation for people to invest the kind of time and activity that they need to do, to really challenge the system, especially, as we're outlining the immense power and organization of our opponents right now. So it's certainly, a really difficult moment. And, we've seen these glimpses, and it's sometimes difficult. And I always remind people who weren't really around before, like the Bernie movement, or the Corbyn movement, also in labor, just how dark it was to be on the left at those times, and the fact that we at least have some forms of apparatuses that need to be improved greatly, but we're in a much better position than we were 5 years ago, but we're nowhere near where we need to be going. It's going to be, anyways, it's a very difficult task for the left. But I think your point about the state is going to be really crucial in that, because we have to understand the way that these apparatuses work to immiserate us, and we have to have a stronger understanding of politics than just, oh, the people at the top are bad, right? Like they are bad, don't get me wrong. But it's not like, oh, if we just
change
explain to Joe Biden how difficult it is to be a working person in America, we'd be living in socialism, right? You need to have institutions. You could want to change the state and even be at the higher levels of power and be unable unable to address that. Yeah, so let me think. I wanted to hit one more quick thing on the Corona economy before we talk a little bit more about this, this state theory stuff, because I think it's really important. And just briefly, because I think it ties in. I really don't want to spend too much time on it because it's been talked about to death. But this most recent GameStop example, is a really good example of that, where it's like, look, there were a lot of people who were engaging in stock market activities, who might not be traditional, like well-off people, but they were also people who could buy, buy stocks on some level, but still, there even within the people who have the ability to buy assets. There is a hierarchy, and there basically are the suckers who end up having to hold the bag at the end of the day for the people who made an incredible amount of money.
I mean, this is absolutely true. I think firstly, it is important to remember that anyone who had the capacity to use a stimulus check for investing rather than just making ends meet is not by any means, well off, but like they're better off than a lot of people who were literally just using those checks to survive. So we're talking about, again, that kind of middle section of earners, and a lot of them as well were kind of younger people as well, rather than the vast mass of working class people in the country. That's important to bear in mind to begin with. That's not to say those people aren't important, because obviously they're a critical part of this coalition. But I think a lot of the time there was a bit of overstatement of the extent to which this was like, people who had nothing else and were putting everything into the stock market. Actually, there were quite a lot of like well-off people who were doing this as well, and some kind of middle and lower.
Do you know who Dave Portnoy is?
I don't think so,
Which
no.
is probably a good thing. He is just like a really great example of this, right? He runs this bro like sports blog in the United States, like super broy,
Okay.
and he sold his blog for a valuation of like $450 million to a big gambling
Bloody hell.
corporation, where they're going to create like an insane gambling corporation in the United States with the media apparatus and the and the sports betting on top of it. Anyway, the guy made an incredible amount of money, and I think he sold the company maybe in January of 2020. So he's been an interesting character to watch, because this is somebody who's flush with cash, and
Yeah.
obviously he lost a significant amount of money on the GameStop thing, right? Because he, of course, is the kind of guy
Yeah.
who is investing in that way, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
people who got flush with cash and were buying and really playing
Yeah.
this game on a large scale. Sorry to interrupt, but
No, that is a
it's too
really
funny.
good
It's a great
example.
example of like,
Yeah.
this enthusiasm that we're seeing.
Yeah. But I think, more broadly, when I wrote a piece about this, I said that this was the kind of this was the action of a group of people who had been convinced that they had no real power as workers. So the only way that they could exercise what little power they had was as owners, as capitalists, basically. And again, this is this phenomenon of the creation of the mini capitalist, person who is encouraged to believe that they have power in the system because they have assets, and whose interests can therefore be manipulated very much by the most powerful people within that hierarchy. And you saw this obviously very clearly with the GameStop saga. I mean, this is a wider trend. If you look at like pension funds, for example, usually pension funds are the ones on the wrong side of a bet when a bet is made by a hedge fund, or they're being taken advantage of by high frequency traders or whatever. They're the big mutual fund guys who just are basically, they have to sit on this money, and it has to be bigger than when they were given it, but they don't have to make tons and tons of money over the short term. They're usually the ones that get screwed over. And yes, those are generally funds that are looking after the savings of middle to upper middle class people, who have their pensions invested in these big funds. So there is a definite hierarchy. That's absolutely true. I mean, there's always hierarchies within capital. This is obviously really important. There's, even if you look at the way this crisis played out now, you see all the support that's being, as we've discussed, chucked at big businesses, leaving small and medium-sized businesses often going under, just because they're on the kind of wrong side of this, growing polarization of power within capital. It doesn't mean they're not capitalists. It's just, this is symptomatic of a kind of reorganization that's happening within the capitalist class, which is obviously important to understand. And it's important to understand not because we can therefore say, oh, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. Like, we like small businesses, we don't like big businesses. It's important because it reflects a change in the balance of power in society as a whole, right? And it also reflects the kind of material conditions within which we're all living, the likely future rates of growth, productivity, innovation, investment, crises, etc. So that's why it's important to understand these processes, not because we can then say, oh, the little guys who are, these plucky young capitalists or investors who are going up against the big old baddies, we should be on their side. Actually, no, because they're never going to be bigger than a kind of, like medium-sized
that's the
chunk of
thing,
the population in the global north. We're
they're
not even
not.
talking about the global south yet.
No, of course, yeah, and we're definitely going to get there soon, because there's some important stuff there. Like, but the point is, like, they're never going to let you in the club. Like all this idea, like with Robinhood, oh, we're democratizing finance. Like fundamentally, what they were like, capitalism is not doing this because it suddenly is like, started reading like democratic theory, and it's like, okay, we need to let the people, and they're like, we need to get people who are going to be willing to buy these asset prices, these stocks when they're at their at their height, because we want to offload them on people, right? And that's why Robinhood was essentially selling information to massive financial organizations to say, like, okay, this is what the young people are doing. Get on the other side of that and make a bag.
I think one of the biggest problems here is that people have a very, very poor understanding of the kind of scale of wealth that exists at the very, very top of society. People don't really know how much $1 billion is, right? And it's like a lot of money. It's like a lot more and a million.
Mm.
And yeah, people think, oh, all these, hundreds of thousands or millions of people investing small amounts of money, that must add up to something. And of course it does add up to something, but compared to just staggering amounts of wealth that exist at the very, very top of the global economy, and remember, we're talking about a global market here, it's nothing. The amount of money that is invested in, these massive, massive funds from all over the world, primarily based off the savings of the very, very wealthy, is huge. And there are obviously other massive institutional players that get capital from all sorts of different sources, like from everything from sovereign wealth funds to other companies. And the scale of their power is massive, even compared to the combined power of the entire American middle class. If they were able to coordinate their interests, which they couldn't, because for a whole host of different reasons. Firstly, they're not a class, really, like, asset holders, people who have pensions are not a class. They're intersected by a number of different class divides, not to mention all sorts of other divides as well. But even if they could, that would still be, they would still be up against some pretty big, powerful institutions that would probably ultimately end up winning, not just because they had more firepower, but because they had closer links with states, with other financial institutions, with all the other kind of players in this system who basically make the rules. And we have this idea of markets, right, as these kind of natural things that exist out there in the world, and you enter into them and you intervene in them. But markets are constructed. There are people who are making the rules of the game every day, and they are usually, in making the rules of the game, talking to the biggest players in the game to decide what rules to set, partly because they don't really understand how the game works, but partly because, there are these mutual interests in making things work for those at the top.